are starting. So I'll get that stuff. It was up. I'll do it off the download. Here we are. So what we're looking at here is basic, and you'll remember this. I know it was a while ago because we do the, and that's why it's something it would be easy to forget about. And they had, images of all the bones and the names of the bones. And I'm not going to trouble anybody with that. That's just not productive. But there's a lot of information here that is easily forgettable because we're thinking about. So I looked at something that surprised me because I didn't make it a point of emphasis as I was looking through this. Now we're there. We know it's a connective tissue. Again, you got to have cells, you got to have fibers. The collagen, it's just filled and filled. They're all collagen fibers. You remember this spiraling one way, spiraling the other way. The ground substance is this unique sort of material that will attract calcium to it to reinforce the structure. So it's got the ground substance and the fibers. They constitute the matrix. They're very much organized in the compact bone, which is what we'll look at, and the cells themselves. Okay, so basically these are starting with these osteogenic or osteoprogenitor cells that are there, and all the stuff it does. Bone's fairly obvious about what it does. So protection of soft tissue, internal organs, movement, big player with calcium. All we do is talk about calcium. Red blood cell, all blood cell productions, energy storage. I think they include that. I don't. To me, it really is not. It's not like, oh, I'm losing weight, my bones are getting thinner. Really not happening. No, in regard to their fat content, that's just fat replaces red bone marrow, and if you need more red bone marrow production, then that yellow bone marrow or fatty bone marrow will convert to red under extreme circumstances. And so I think that's the least important. But since I've seen it a couple of times in print, that could be one of those neat. Is it an all of the above? Is there an exception? You might. That's the way when I look at those questions and read them, I see so many little tricks with regard to that. 4 types of cells surrounded by an extensive calcium protein matrix, notably calcium, variety of proteins because collagen is basically all protein. The progenitor cells, they make osteoblasts. They secrete, obviously, the fibers, the organic compounds, depending on whether they're doing the secretion in the cortical bone, very organized. We'll get to the osteon. And if we're doing it in cancellous bone, disorganized the wrong term, less organized, probably a better way to describe it. This is the part I forgot really to even mention when I was lecturing. They are not capable of mitosis. So when you remember we constantly replace our bone. We're constantly we're taking bone out. We're constantly changing it over. It is not when you think of typically cells and connective tissue, you think they can be reproductive. So that was something that surprised me. So, and the osteoblast and the osteocytes are the same cell, it's just different degrees of activity. The osteoblast busy releasing the matrix materials, and they become enveloped by them. As the matrix hardens around them, we get the osteocytes, again, incapable of mitosis. But they can do business because of those remember those long turnicle-like projections that were there? Remember the canaliculi? Because you had the canals going vertically, you had the canals going horizontally, but circumferentially you had these sort of cytoplasmic processes that extended and nearly, if not did, make contact with other cells, and they were the sort of, particularly in the cortical bone, that was that sort of cerclage or circulating pattern, so we call canaliculi or little canals. So I mean, I'd go back and just look at that, just in case they throw diagrams at you and looking at the roles of the different things that are there. So, and again, the general structure of most bones is important. Long, the 4 different types: long, short, flat, irregular. Examples of each would be important. They are going to focus on the typical long bone. And the whole idea, you have a shaft, the other name is diaphysis. You have to know the name. Okay, and the 2 ends are and the transition zone is the physis is technically an area where the bone is growing. So the diaphysis is sort of, it's in the middle of the shaft. Then you get an area that's beyond that called the metaphysis, the transition, and then the epiphyses, epi would be on the exterior. So think of it the top and bottom of bone, if you will, whatever, inside, outside of bone. So they're the ends of the bone, so to speak. So a sheet of cartilage between the epiphysis and the metaphysis is really that epiphyseal plate where the lengthening goes on. And yeah, it's principally all about growth hormone and the spurts, adolescent, even pre-adolescent. I had a good observation of that vis-a-vis grandchildren. My stepdaughter, my daughter-in-law, my stepdaughter, my daughter was complaining about how many times she has to buy shoes. Here at 101. Like any responsible grandparent, waited until we were leaving to give them toys, particularly the noisy ones. If, like friends of yours, or when they start to have kids and you don't, you want to go over and say, "Oh, I have a gift." And you bring that noisy toy, that little drag along thing that makes noise. Love it. They will turnabout fair play. What goes around comes around. So if you decide to have kids, that's coming back at you. They may even re-gift that. Love that. Those kids, there's going to be beads everywhere. It's a beat-a-thon. So each bone, two main types of bone structure, spongy and compact. The spongy, typically interior, compact bone surrounds it. This is a classic. It is really the only place we see this. This distinction from compact or cortical bone and spongy or cancellous bone is in the long bone. I mean, there's some elements of it in other areas. And yeah, spongy bone, again, trabecular or cancellous bone. Trabecular just really is another name for that sort of interesting pattern that really looks like it's not specific, but it is. Like these little underpinnings for support that develop. And an adherent to that is the red bone marrow. And then all, not just red blood cell development, all blood cell development. Compact or cortical, surrounding the hollowed out area. Again, that area, by definition, we call the medullary cavity. And then, again, it only holds yellow bone marrow if the bone is no longer actively producing blood, which typically happens for the vast majority of our bones when we reach adulthood. The only ones that are not, we looked at it in the blood unit, that are, you have the shoulder and hip as they get close to ball and socket portion of the joint, as you're getting into the metaphyseal bone and the upper epiphysis, superior epiphyses, which we call them head, on humerus and on femur, as well as those are really examples of long bones that retain it. Even though we don't necessarily utilize it, there's blood formation there, but obviously the flat bones in the iliac crest, the remainder of the pelvis, the sternum, all the other flat bones there are part of it as well. So that's really important. Remember that. Obviously, these don't come up particularly well. Here's the view. So really, to remember, to me, it's when it comes to bone, this is the principal structural unit, which plays a role in function vis-a-vis strength and remodeling that are there, because it's much more random when you get here. You get the importance of the exterior, tremendous importance of again. You're looking at periosteum. It is much thicker than you think. It is not delicate at all. The only time it begins to thin is it approaches the epiphyses and makes a transition. It makes a subtle transition, and all of a sudden, the next thing you know, you have the exterior capsule around joints. Having operated on enough of those things, I can't tell you enough, particularly for you guys, MCAB-wise, medically wise, how important that periosteum is. That's where all the nerve fibers, the pain fibers are from. There's nominal amounts that are inside. Tearing of the periosteum, repairing it. Somebody has a broken bone, and the reason why it hurts so much if they move it, and comparatively little once it's immobilized, is because the periosteum Because once it's damaged, like once the bone is, it's so busy producing the repair elements. When you have busy tissue and you begin to move it around, its whole goal is to produce the bone elements to stabilize the fracture. So it's growing little nerve endings, and all of a sudden it's not securely immobilized. I remember studying with some orthopods, orthopedic surgeons, and they were good. They had your bone healing where they learned a lot about it. It was in Europe, particularly because of all the skiing, downhill. They do a lot. Winter sports are really big. Here, there's little clusters of them that are there. I mean, obviously maybe water skiing applies in certain areas, but they would have a convention with regard to this that these guys went to every year. So they went every year. The orthopedic surgeons, one of them, this large group, and they take along one or more of the residents with the guests, and it was good money in that, to Davos, Switzerland. That was where, not a bad trip. One guy's telling me he had his fiance with the lead orthopedic surgeon and his wife, and I mean it was party time. Other than that, but you learned a ton. And what they came out with when it came to healing of bone and controlling pain, rigid fixation, complications, effective healing, pain, all of those were reduced if you could make sure that the bone was secure. And that really has become, and other friends of mine went and studied metallurgy, and they studied in Germany, and they studied because they were very advanced in this. A lot of the classifications for fractures in sport, you might remember me telling you about that when we talked about ankle fractures a little bit. And it came from downhill skiing and cross-country skiing. I mean, they knew a lot more about it than we did. We learned from them, which is good. So I think it was very ahead of its time. And again, I'm sure they use variations of those same things. Even for people who are just taking orthopedics as a class, even that's not going to be their area of specialization. But around here, we get a lot of those. One of our students graduated. Lacey graduated. She's doing her orthopedic residency now at Tulane. All about that, focusing on fractures and things like that. Really, really good program. So here you can see as we take a look inside, and you're looking at the lacuna. Remember, that's that sort of enclosure. To me, it's more of an optical illusion because it doesn't stain. You have the canaliculi, which are more side-to-side channels. We're allowing the osteocytes and those projections of cytoplasm and membrane to communicate and signal one another. So, and then you have this tremendous blood supply because you had the central canal and the main blood supply, and then you had at right angles to that the haversian canals. Okay, so another name for those haversian canals here's the haversian canal rather vertically, and the Volkmann's canal with right angles to it, and the canaliculi again are more circumferential. So all of that's important. There's specific where the change goes from cartilage to bone. You might remember is right around the start of what we call the nutrient artery, and that opening that persists when you look at bone anatomically. You don't see it in the bones we had. So while they've been distorted, it's called the nutrient foramen. That's really important from a surgical perspective because if you're operating on bone, you don't want to work on that side. You want to stay away with it because you interrupt. If you interrupt the blood supply to the bone, you're going to kill the bone, at least for a period of time. So those are the ways. So for people going into medical school, it serves you very well. Anatomy that's why it's foundational. Like every school, whether it's osteopathic, whether it's allopathic, whether like ours was a subset being podiatric, whether it's veterinary, wherever the areas are, the anatomy is your guide. That anatomy it's your fallback position. Like they were doing, I meant to tell you about the procedure because it's sort of in this unit anyway. So, I mean, he's had 1,000 injuries, Tiger Woods. And they just, in addition, so it's not, and it may not be related to any of those injuries, maybe just probably the ferocity of his training trying to get back with a relatively stiff leg to try to get back and play the Masters because he's never going to be the same. And they're doing now, it used to be a giant procedure. You have a big cut along the Achilles tendon, and you go in, and you flap down tissue, and and they did a limited incision procedure, what they call it, MIS, minimal incision procedure, and basically inserted a particular kind of suture, sort of went back and forth. It's a common suturing technique, just to access it, and you bring it in and bring it in and bring it in. It's something if you sewed, you would. It's almost like a more complicated version, what's called a mattress suture. So if you sew, you're familiar with that. So I was amazed they introduced it to show it to you. I don't know the severity of it. Here's the tendon. Here's the rest of the tendon. Here's attaching here to the calcaneus, the bone, and they introduced. I don't know what side they introduced it from, but the suture kind of came in, and they did. You reef it through. You make a right in contact points, and then you pull these out. And what it does is it will pull the ends together. Pull it together. That's a lot of the ways when we do tendon surgery. That's what we do. The design is to. It's famous. The surgeon who did that in England was named Sterling Bunnell, Bunnel, and that's a variation. It was called Bunnell-Bouton surgical technique. So, but we used to do it wide open. That's pretty interesting from a standpoint. So, just to give you an idea of a lot of technology in orthopedics is very, very fascinating. Not easy. So compact bone, highly organized structure. They're continuing, and that's the watchword, continuously replaced. So it's not mitosis, it's a remodeling. Basically, as the cells either no longer can function or there's changing in forces, like someone like me, as you get older, use certain areas more, use certain things less, it's going to remodel accordingly. Yeah, just the way it works. And obviously, as you get older, there's a greater tendency to get more osteoporotic. I am confident I am shrunk. Or it was my daughter's ridiculous stack heels for the wedding. Hello, how you doing up there? And I know she's shorter than I am. So, osteoblasts in the lamellae that are known as haversian canals. The entire system is called a haversian or Haversham, doesn't matter who pronounces it. Fancy name for for the accumulation of that is called an osteon. And you remember how the collagen fibers go clockwise and counterclockwise that are there, that provides, and all those neat little bonds when you go back up there. I don't know if they'll talk about it. But in between these sort of pillars, and it's like a multiple series of pillars distributing the weight, you have little bits of bonds that are there. You have these interstitial lamellae, these little bits of the similar bone, but not as well organized, kind of like gluing the little pillars together. And then you have in the exterior these circumferential layers. Lamellae means layer outside. And because of that, in between the pillars as they ascend and the concentric, there's little bonds they give way called sacrificial bonds. So when you think of how many times you in sport, your ankle's twisted, you go, oh my God, something bad's going. It doesn't. How did I get away with this not breaking? A lot of times it's absorbing that remarkably. So it's the design is part of that system that's there. So haversian canals, the major blood supply, blood, lymph, crossing canals with the Volkmann canals, the osteocytes create that exchange area for nutrients and chemical signaling canaliculi. Again, endocrine control, parathyroid hormone certainly predominates in this. Calcium levels in the bloodstream, and effectively what parathyroid hormone is activating the other cell that we haven't talked about, even because the other ones are kind of all the same. The osteoprogenitor cell, the osteocyte, the osteoblast, and the osteoclast, which are really little clusters of really derivative from monocytes and macrophages that are triggered by the parathyroid hormone. And the osteoclasts break down the bone so that the calcium is stored, part of the bone matrix, released in the blood, other hormones, vitamin D, okay, work in the other direction, help to restore calcium stores in the bone by promoting calcium absorption through the digestive system. So vitamin D works with parathyroid because they're all basically increasing it in the bloodstream. But if you think of it, does it help to restore it? Yeah, because it makes it more abundant in the bloodstream. The question is it going to stay in the bloodstream, or are we going to put it, basically excess gets put back in bone. If there's greater needs, we pull it out of the bone. It's just a neat little storage system that works. So, and again, osteoclasts break them down, osteoblasts form them. So calcium regulation, very, very important. As you can see there, so most calcium in the blood is not in the form of free calcium ions. Instead, it's mainly bound to proteins and sometimes to phosphates, okay, particularly calcium phosphate related. And so again, calcium, and this is generic, it depends because it works differently on the heart, on the electrical system as well as the mechanical system. Too much calcium causes membranes to become hypoexcitable, fatigue, and memory loss. That would be in the brain. Too little results in cramps and convulsions. I think that's broad brush. I just think if you want to remember that, the too much calcium in general makes things less excitable. I'll buy that. And too little convulsions, I'll buy that. Cramps are a little more complicated. I think things like that are much more complicated. I mean, it's a lot of electrolyte imbalances. A lot we really don't understand. Well, they are. So again, most of the body's calcium stored as the hydroxyapatite. Remember, that's that very interesting sort of molecule that comes from calcium phosphate. And you can see that I can't go in and write the chemical formula. Strike me as go see Badger about that. And so that particularly adheres well to the calcium into these proteins that really are we call calcium binding proteins that are part of the matrix. Okay, great compressive ability. Okay, some calcium is stored in the bone. It's a little more soluble as does calcium hypophosphate. Salts buffer plasma calcium levels all the time. So all of these things are present depending on the need for all of this. I think that it's just basically a nice little summary. The fact that it does mostly calcium metabolism is just so freaking important with all of these things. I just can't. It's just reiterating the same points, whether it's calcium, whether it's potassium, whether it's sodium, those positively charged ions, big trouble when they get out. Big trouble. And then here's the different shapes. You can read through that, which longer than they're wide. The short bones, the issue is they're irregular, but really they have very little cortex, a whole lot of joint bearing surface, a whole lot of articular cartilage, cancellous bone in the middle. So when there's trauma, it's very easy for them to become arthritic. Wrists and ankles are particularly predisposed to arthritic deterioration. So I mean, it's a freaking minefield. Those things, and some of them blood supply is more fragile, and that's something else that I mentioned. You might remember in passing with bone. It's a diagnosis nobody wants to have to give to a patient called avascular necrosis. It means the bone's dying from lack of blood supply. Whether they dislocated a hip, and you remember going into that fovea centralis, fovea capita centralis, the one that's right into, that's the blood supply to the ball. The ball will deteriorate. Again, it was a career ender for Bo Jackson. It's not the only athlete that's happened to. There's a lot historically. Late Bill Walton, that was a career ender for him. When it was in the navicular bone of his foot, I knew one of the guys who operated on him. He made it worse. So a lot of times, you'll find that in surgery and in orthopedics particularly, some doctors think they have magic in their finger. It's almost like they messed it up, I'll fix it. Sometimes that can get you in trouble. The late Dr. Freddie Fruit was like that. Good Okay, put sports medicine on the map here in Pittsburgh. Show you how crazy my oldest is. What did he do last weekend? Other than be at home with his wife, who has to watch those two little bandits. He runs a half marathon. So he's only half crazy down in Norfolk. Could you get a car? And they made him, he's now supposed to be, he has to become the AI expert for the surface warfare part of it. And I don't know anything about it. I'm not sure he knows a lot about it, but he's learning on the fly. It's typically what they do in the military. We need you to be the expert. They had to do a presentation on it. Tuesday morning to like Wednesday morning to like 50 bigwigs. Oh God, crazy. So all those things about the bones that are there, and ankle and wrist predominate. They're not the only ones. The kneecap is like that. Flat bones, you remember them: sternum, ribs, skull. Aspects, the shoulder blade, the iliac crest, are there. Organ protecting. Regular, to me, I mean, other than the ossicles of the ears, I think really the vertebrae themselves are a better illustration of that. And they don't have a lot here about cartilage and things like that, comparatively speaking. Very resilient. Yes, it's flexible. It's I would classify it as semi-solid, depending on where it is. Not all cartilage is created equal. You have like the costal cartilages between your sternum and your rib cage. Yeah, there's a fair amount of give to them. I'll buy that. Is there? Not all of them. So I mean, that's hyaline cartilage like this. You can do that just when somebody it's Roethlisberger when he get hit with a helmet numerous times. One game he came out, his nose was sideways. And then a year later, they looked at it and they put it back. He splinted. Did you ever see some of his pictures with his nose distorted? Goes with the territory. A lot of sports have broke boxers. That was sad. Big George died. George Foreman. Did you see that? Most people know him for the George Foreman grills and all of that. And he very interesting character. Came back at age like 44 and actually won the heavyweight from a guy from Menneson, Michael Moore, who was the title holder at the time, and just basically developed a defensive strategy where he would just hold himself. He was great at defense. But Moore punched him out. It was like Muhammad Ali with rope-a-dope back in, which beat Foreman, so he used the same strategy, but he had a killer punch. And as Moore punched himself out in about the 9th round, he was starting to falter, and Foreman saw that and just went, okay, bang. Timber. This is all defensive strategy because he got that. It was huge. He was, as a young guy, I mean, this is 6'4", 220 chiseled, going against an older Ali who hadn't cut. Ali just it's crazy. So I will buy that with regard to the cartilage, the 3 types: fibrocartilage, intervertebral disc is really the best answer, menisci in the knee, elastic to 2 areas again, auricles of the ear, the epiglottis, that's it. And then the joints themselves, varying amounts of movements, know the categories. Fibrous joints are generally rigid. They may start off as flexible as the fibers retracts over time and mature. They pull the bones together. So together by fibrous connective tissue, extremely minimal movement. So effectively, we don't think they move. Okay, the skull, the sutures. Cartilaginous, amphiarthrotic, these are synarthrotic, meaning they don't move. Okay, the cartilage gives them a subtle amount of motion, and then synovial, freely moving. Okay, anytime, and typically that'll be the way that you should be familiar with the fact that the capsule, the synovial, is a lubricating fluid. It has a very delicate lining, very similar to endothelia, blood vessels in the heart. So it's fibrous on the outside, secretes synovial fluid, which is a unique fluid. It's a sterile environment inside. Phagocytic cells are there, and the problem that really is the damage to cartilage and joints and blood. Blood is an erosive factor. So there's severe sprains and strains. You end up with that type of thing to give you the different types of joints. And lastly, the skin. Okay, it's still the skin. See how time-wise we can get the skin. It's the largest organ by definition by size. Largest gland is the liver. And those are sort of elementary questions, freestanding. Gland, liver, organ, skin. So wide number of functions. They just go thermoregulation. We've gone over that a number of times. Evaporation. Okay, that's one way. But again, most of the dissipation, we just talked about this recently, is heat being dissipated as we redirect circulation to the skin. Okay, radiation is only effective if the body temperature is higher than the room temperature. So surface capillaries, greater heat loss. We shunt things all over the place. Sweating, vasoconstriction, dilation, depending on it. There's a variety of influences. We know that hair standing on end, sympathetic stimulation. And skin obviously has a ton of receptors: hot, cold, sharp, dull, pain receptors. There's just very sensitive, and it's just some areas more so than the other. That's it. Areas with thick, heavy skin, particularly the low back area. You can test that. We didn't do it. There's that 2-point. It's like it looks like a compass, like you draw a circle, but it has sharp points on both sides, and you can open and close it like you would like a caliper. Okay. And tap, that type of thing that you can do. And you go to a place here, you'd be able, oh yeah, it's hitting me in 2 places. If you make it as wide as possible or as small as possible, you can still discriminate. You put it on the back, well, you're poking me. How many times is that poking you? Once, twice, or there 3 pokes at the same time? You go, nah, just one. But really, it's got 2 eggs, so that we call that 2-point discrimination. That's very used. Those are areas where there's an abundance versus an absence, relative absence of things like that. The barrier aspect, mechanical, physical, chemical, all the different inputs, osmoregulation that are there. So we can effectively, there's a certain amount of water, a certain amount of electrolytes by excretion and sweating that contribute to it. Major barrier for immunity, sampling the environment. Obviously, the blood reservoir, important role of vitamin D, so that's endocrine functions. And then we have the epidermis and the 2 layers of the dermis. Can't forget those. So you have 3 different types of connective tissue. You have epidermis, stratified squamous, keratinizing. You have luceralular underneath it, which you have underneath all epithelia, and then you have that dense, irregular connective tissue, which is great for anchoring glands and anchoring hairs and anchoring structures, but has minimal blood supply. Because epithelial tissues don't. It all comes from that luceralular because it's got space and things can diffuse. The trouble with the blood supply, it's very limited, so what happens is scar tissue. That's really, when we look at full thickness burns, something I would review, means it gets into that deep dermal layer. Partial thickness means it's either confined to the epidermis or separates the epidermis and superficial dermal layer with blistering. So as long as it's confined there to the superficial dermis, it'll heal. So and because both these layers, so beneath both of these layers is subcutaneous or fatty tissue. So the fancy name we talk about that is superficial fascia. We were taught to make a cut for whatever reason in skin. Whatever procedure you're doing, you want that cut to go right down to fascia through this epidermis, the dermis, and the deep dermis. And what would happen, because you would be having either you or somebody else would be putting tension. Things cut better with tension. All of a sudden, you see it almost like, it wouldn't be just like a slit. All of a sudden, that slit would widen magically. And you see all that fatty stuff. That's perfect. That's a perfect incision. And then and at that point, now you begin to look for little bleeders because that's where there'll be blood supplies and nerve supplies. If it's big vessels, pull them out of the way. Big nerves, pull them out of the way. We identify them, we retract them out of the field, and then cauterize. Depends on what you do. I mean, if you're over somebody's hip, you're not too worried about being pretty, that type, so to speak. I mean, you should be cognizant of it. So all of those things are part of that. We call that superficial fascia. When you hear about deep fascia, and we used to think it was part of the skin, the superficial fascia, but it's really not. Deep fascia is like the dividing stuff between big muscles. So, or wrapping the muscle around the thigh or around the leg. So you have the crural fascia around the leg, what's called the fascia lata around the thigh. I mean, it's there. So epidermis avascular, all the things, protection, the 4 cells, mostly the dermatophytes, the keratinocytes, okay, use the keratin, waterproof, etc. The melanocytes, typically around 10%, could be more, up to 25%. And then the Langerhans cells, which are all about sampling the immune system. Whenever you have pathway to the external environment, you have them in the gut, you have them in the liver, basically they're samplers. Okay, like that. And Merkel cells, the ones that sit on top of sensory nerves. Okay, and then and remember the layers, the strata, 5 layers, palm soles, even that low back area. So, and again, where they are, the Merkel cells, the stem cells, the stratum basal, all those, the Langerhans cells, basically they're anchored there, but their tentacles go all the way through. They continually dividing to make keratinocytes and replacements. And they get kind of like being pushed from the bottom out to the top. And obviously, as they get away from their blood supply, they die. Okay. They slough off. 25, the outer, and this is more accurate. Typical textbooks, I think it's 30 to 40. If you summarize, you look, there are about 25 to 30 layers of that stratum corneum out here. So, I mean, you can look through all of those things, structures that are underneath it. When you get to the epidermis, it's not flat, obviously. We have to remember those reedy ridges and reedy pegs being so important. And again, at the more friction or pressure, it gets stimulated. And that's why we have a calloused hand. If you're working with equipment, whatever you do for a living, particularly if you're doing more manual labor than you have delicate hands like I have. And so again, the derivation with this is ectoderm. Now we're in mesoderm. From the dermis, all the things it has: collagen, elastic fibers, reticular fibers, transmission of the hair follicles, etc., etc. A lot of glands, all hair, it's nearly all hairs have a sebaceous gland, an oil gland. It's almost like a lubricant as they exit. Okay. And again, obviously the erector pili muscle, okay. Sweat glands, variety of different types. Most of them are eccrine. Some people call it merocrine. And remember, doesn't have a lot of fatty content. The apocrine, the holocrine glands are hair follicles. The sebaceous glands are very oily. The apocrine, typically associated with axilla and groin, maybe in a lactating breast gland situation. There's like a mixture of fatty and liquid, and then the ones that are pure liquid, really just perspiration, what we call merocrine or eccrine sweat glands. It's the apocrine, different regions, you have more odor associated, and then the appendages are really variations, the hair and the nails, variations of the keratin. Stronger keratin in the hair and the nails, but very, very similar if you go back and look at those, what I like to call the analogous structures. And in order to do it. So we'll do those questions. I'll ask you those first, and then we'll go into muscles on Wednesday. We're out with nobody getting hurt. I'm making it short, my poor you. Oh, my goodness. This children thing just has to stop.